Hello. So today we're going to be talking about something that is nearly as old and battered as I am, the Canon EF 300mm F4 telephoto lens. Now I bought this thing back in the 90s, 30 years ago or something like that, back when we were shooting film. Cost me nearly £1,000 back then. That sounds like a lot of money, doesn't it, for 30 years ago? And I've been using it pretty much ever since, in all the different cameras that have come and gone since then: film, digital, DSLR, and now all the way through to the R mirrorless camera that you see here with the adapter. And it's still doing a pretty good job. I'm making this video in particular because a few of my subscribers spotted this thing making a cameo appearance in the background of one of my other videos, and they showed interest. I'm talking about you in particular, Jordan B. Thank you very much for your interest and your support over the last few years. Much appreciated. If you haven't already, please do consider subscribing if you're new to the channel. I am trying to grow this channel. It was the smallest photography YouTube channel on the planet, and it probably still is, but it is growing. So you could be one of the first, you can be one of the pioneers, the originals, the OGs if you like. So thank you all for your support as always. So I'm going to go on to show you a few of the pictures that I've taken with it over the years, a weird eclectic group of pictures. And I'm going to come back to talk about my experiences of using it, good things about it, bad things about it, and how it stacks up against some of the more modern technology in this day and age. But if you want the long story short, it's still very good. It's 300mm f4 bright, fast telephoto lens. There are more modern, slicker, smoother, more flexible, faster options out there now. Of course there are. We're talking 3 decades later. But I think this thing still holds its ground enough to make it still worth talking about in this day and age. Let's have a look at a few pictures and we'll come back and dive into a bit more of a deeper conversation about it. Okay, so that really was an eclectic group of pictures, but it kind of represents what I've been using this lens for over the years, so I guess it kind of shows you what a lens like this is capable of. Anyway, let's dive back in history. Let's dive back to the 1990s. I was shooting film. I was mostly covering news at home and overseas, traveling a lot, and I was using also some of the big old primes, the 300-2.8, the 600 f4 when I needed them. But I always liked the smaller nature of this, and there weren't that many options around for telephoto lenses back then. Sort of quite much more limited than it is now, that's for sure. I like the fact that it was small, light, and if you're jumping on planes a lot, that's a real benefit. You don't want to be carrying those big old primes around unless you have to. And I love the fact that it would go in a belt pack on my belt, a belt pouch. And that's how this thing has spent a lot of its life. Kind of being almost secondary in many ways to, I would typically have 2 cameras, one with a long 70-200, one with a wide, something like 16-35. And that's where I would do most of my news shooting. But if I needed something long, I would have this on a pouch. But because of that, it kind of got a battering because it was always just kind of like an extra in many ways, and it got rolled down. Everything bad that you can imagine that's happened to a lens has happened to this. It's got dust in it, it's got fungus in it, it's got dings taken out of it, cracks all across it. There's a great big graunch of glass missing out of the front of it. Don't quite know how that happened, but I think it was, I seem to remember this thing had a particularly bad time on a shoot in South Africa where I was covering, a yacht race, a round the world yacht race, and I had to go out to meet a certain boat arriving near Cape Town in the early hours of the morning, and it was really rough on a little inflatable rib, way offshore, big waves coming over. I was trying to sort of protect my kit as best I could, but then somehow this thing, you know, you're being thrown around all over the place. Somehow this thing came out of its pouch and I found it just sort of rolling around in the bottom of the rib, kind of in the seawater and diesel, just kind of you know, having its worst day really. And I can remember looking at it thinking, oh no, that thing is totally screwed now. That is not going to live again. But I bought it back, dried it out, and it's been working pretty much fine ever since. That's kind of how I've continued to use it for all sorts of different things, from sports to news to features and wildlife and everything in between. You know, portraits sometimes, surfing. A lot of the time I've used it in a very sort of pretty hostile environment, if I'm honest, and it just continues to work. Doesn't have weather sealing, but that doesn't seem to bother it one bit. This is kind of pre-weather sealing. You know, as I've said before, you know, I don't really have weather sealing either, but I kind of cope okay. Who knows? And forward we go, right, into the world of digital mirrorless cameras. And really, these things with their advanced focusing system have breathed new life into lenses like this, because although they don't increase the speed of the focusing, I think they've increased the accuracy of the focusing and maybe the smoothness. And so using this thing on a camera like the R5 or the R8 here, you know, it's actually really wonderful. And although it's not quite as fast as some of the other options that are out there, it doesn't do a bad job considering its age. Okay, so let's talk about some of the good things about it, some of the bad things about it. So I've got other telephoto lenses. I've got 70-200 EF lens. I've got a 70-300. I've got the RF 100-400 and a couple of others as well. So this isn't kind of my only option, but I still use it often, more often than you might imagine. And one of the biggest benefits of this lens that none of those other things have is its party trick, which is its F4 aperture. Now, if you live in a particularly sunny part of the world where it's bright all the time and you're used to using, you know, used to that sort of level of light, then that aperture might not bother you so much. You might not, you know, might be quite happy with that RF 100-400 or something with a slightly less bright aperture. Because you've got high light levels, right? If you live in a dark and dingy country like the UK during the winter and you're trying to shoot stuff in the late afternoon and evening when light is sort of practically non-existent, even on modern cameras that have these amazing high ISO capabilities. I mean, back in the day, it was essential to have that F4 aperture, but these days it's less so. But even with these amazing sensors and high ISO capability that we now have, having that extra couple of stops of F to F4 is still useful sometimes, especially if you're trying to freeze action. You know, lots of times when you're using a telephoto lens, you are trying to freeze action. And so being able to shoot at, let's say, 1,000th of a second at f4 as opposed to 250th at f8, you might get a little bit of movement at that f8, 250th of a second setting. So there's not many other things around, even today, that kind of do that, that do that party trick. There's obviously brighter lenses, but they're at a much higher price point. And then there are darker lenses which you can be a bit more flexible with, understood. But there's nothing, I don't think, let me know what you think, because, you know, 300mm f4 is still a little bit of a party trick. Also, you get the benefit of the bokeh, the separation, that if you're shooting a portrait on this, let's say, for example, of a footballer, I don't know, like before a match, you're going to get a footballer with the stadium in the background and you're using this. You're going to throw that background a little bit more naturally out of focus using this than you are with a lens with an f8 aperture. And that can look pleasing. That can render really nice results without using AI or technology to do it. It just takes nice pictures. They look nice. And that's the nature of this game, right? Taking nice pictures. And this thing takes nice pictures. Maybe it's not as flexible as some of the others, but that f4 aperture is a big win for me. Another plus point is it's got a built-in lens hood and it's got a lens collar that comes with it. That sort of sounds ridiculous saying that, but actually both of those things are very handy being on it, and you know, they seem to be sadly missing from from a lot of the lenses these days. Another good point about it is it's just a sexy beast. Look at it. I really like it. This is something that I actually like owning and using. There's something about it, the manual nature of it, the hefty switches, just the build quality. You know, this thing is so super simple, so super strong, and so super sexy that It's just one of those things that I don't think I'll ever get rid of. Is that a good reason is that a good point about the lens? I think so, because how you feel about this stuff does matter to some degree. The next plus point is that it's a fixed prime. Now, you will know the difference between zoom lenses and prime lenses. Prime lenses typically are a little bit optically better, but zoom lenses tend to be a bit more flexible, although that gap has closed now, maybe even crossed over to some extent. But there is something beautiful about shooting with a fixed focal length prime, depending on what it is that you're trying to do. Everybody will have different purposes, but for me, going out with this versus, let's say, a 70 to 300 or 100 to 400, I know that I've got more flex with the zoom, and under some circumstances I will definitely prefer the zoom to use. But actually, just being stuck at one focal length can be quite kind of liberating and nice. And because you've got just that one focal length, the lens is engineered to give maximum optical performance from that 300mm focal range. So it's sharp. This thing is tack sharp, I tell you. I took a picture, I may have included it in the selection. I shot some daffodils very recently using this thing to pick the daffodils out. And we'll come on to the macro nature of this, because it is not a macro lens. That's one of the bad points. But you can still get reasonably close, 2.5 meters. So I got 2.5 meters away from some daffodils, shot some pictures, and then I was just looking at them in Lightroom, and you can actually see an insect crawling out of one of those flowers. It's sharp. It's as sharp as anything that you could possibly want. And that's on a 30-year-old dinged up, fungus-filled, dusty version of this. So, optically, it's reasonable. Okay, just looking at my notes, there's one other thing that is good about this that I want to bring to your attention. In that, if you stick it on a crop sensor body like the R7, or use the crop ability within the RF cameras these days, like the R5, for example, you end up with the equivalent of a 480mm f4 telephoto lens, which is optically sharp. And that's very cool. Now, I know that there'll be people that are kind of making noise. Oh, it's not a 480mm equivalent. It's only a 300mm and blah, 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 blah. But to me, it gives the field of view of a 480mm lens if I'm shooting something. Let's say I'm shooting a surfer and they're a long way away and I put it on a crop sensor body, they become closer, right? I know that everyone will talk differently about it, but to me, that's how it works in the real world. And that's cool. 480mm f4 optically sharp lens on one of those crop sensors, the R7. I've not used it on the R7, but I bet it's be very good. It's pretty good on the R5 with the crop ability, which I use sometimes. Okay, on to the bad points. So there are a lot of bad points, right? Firstly, there's no image stabilization. Now, depending on what you're shooting, how you shoot, this might or might not be a deal breaker for you. My own personal experience is that most of the things that I shoot on a telephoto lens, I tend to want to freeze action. And that means using a shutter speed of 500th of a second or above. Not always, but if you can. And so that negates a lot of the IS advantages for me. On the R5 or some of the other bodies, there is in-body image stabilization, which works reasonably well. Sort of negates some of the lack of IS. Now, about 15 years ago, I had the opportunity to buy a 300mm f4 IS version to replace this at a budget price. And I tried them for a day. I shot them side by side for a day to see if I could really see any real difference between them and if it was worth the money. And I genuinely couldn't see the difference in my use, so I just didn't do it. I stuck with this one. That doesn't mean to say that if you have a use for IS for what you're shooting, then it could be a deal breaker for you. It's big, it's heavy in comparison to, let's say, the RF 100 to 400, and it's slower as well. Even though it's got the faster f4 aperture, the autofocus is a bit graunchy, a bit slow, a bit, stop-starty. But it's 30 years old, you know, and it still does the job. It still works fine. I mean, I'm just so blown away that the motors aren't corroded in this. The amount of time it's spent more time in the sea than a pod of dolphins, I tell you, over the years. The fact that it's not rusted to pieces is a miracle. But yeah, the autofocus is a little bit slow. But you know, I'm a little bit slow too, right? I mean, you know, I can still do 50 press-ups and run 5 miles. It's just that I do it a little bit slower than someone half my age, you know. Speed isn't everything, is it? Okay, so the obvious next negative, and just a kind of good thing to talk about really, is the fact that there are a lot of other options out there now. Now, I don't know about this price point, because secondhand you can pick these things up for, you know, 250 to sort of 500 pounds, depending for the whether you're a battered old one like this might be at the cheap end, a clean mint IS version might be at that top end, and that's a good price for an L telephoto lens. But there are other options out there now, in particular that RF 100 to 400 that I've made another video about, which I think is super powerful and in so many ways is actually better. If you're in a place where there's good light, I would recommend that lens. I think it focuses accurately, it focuses really close, it's super light, it's super cheap, it's about 500, 600 pounds, so sort of comparable-ish. You could probably get a used one for the similar price to this. Super flexible, and the only thing I don't like about it really is, you know, have a look at my video about it if you're interested in it. But there are other options. I know that Canon have just launched an RF 75 to 300mm f4 to 5.6 budget lens. Now, that doesn't have IS either, so, you know, kind of similar. I've not used it, I might play with it, but I think that's about 300 pounds. That's really cheap. I wonder how that would stack up optically against this. Could be a good comparison for the future, couldn't it? I mean, holy smoke, that price point's amazing. And then, you know, you have your 70 to 200 2.8s or f4s, maybe with a converter. Always been a good option, always been a good compromise. And I think on the R bodies that would be even better, but that's quite a lot of money. Then, of course, you've got your other EF lenses. You know, most notably the 100 to 400mm Mark II that they did, which is great, optically great, very flexible, but a bit bigger, a little bit heavier, a little bit more expensive, but optically really good. I've used that a lot, that lens. And then my other sweet spot lens is that 70 to 300mm f4 to 5.6 L EF lens, which again I've made another video about on my channel, which was my travel lens of choice for a long time actually, which kind of made this a bit redundant to some degree unless I needed that f4 aperture. You know, we're diving back in time now. So there are other options out there, more modern, more flexible options, but I still think that if you're looking for something that can shoot at that f4 aperture, I still think that this is kind of, you know, punches well above its weight considering what an old beast it is. Look, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope there's been something here for you. Let me know if you have any questions. And like I said, please do consider subscribing and giving me a like or a comment. Good day to you. Goodbye.